created the higher score guarantee, which was sort of an industry game changer at the time. And started test prep and tutoring professionals in 2010 or 11. And Mindprint has been one of our sponsors, one of our partners, and just a great group to be working with. And we're really pleased to be joined by the COO of Mindprint, Neil Seltzer. Neil, go ahead and just explain to people, your background as well, because you're also a test prep industry vet of many years. So feel
Sure.
free.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I taught my first SAT student in 1992 in Hong Kong. So that was, I think I'm going on maybe 30 years now. Along the way, I ran a number of Princeton Review franchises. I ran a company that owned Princeton Review franchises. I took over their R&D for a long time. So my specialty was GRE. So I wrote the courses, trained the teachers, wrote the testing engine. Most recently, I built Noodle Pros and left. They're New York based, but now worldwide. I left them about a year and a half ago, specifically to join Mindprint, because frankly, it was the newest and most exciting and innovative thing I've seen in the world of test prep in a very long time. I think it is a herald of the future of tutoring. I think it's where the industry is going. And it was exciting to me to be a part of that and help build out specifically the tutor and tutoring company support tools for Mindprint. And that's a lot of what I want to talk about today.
That's terrific. And yeah, and I think, using cognitive testing as a means to just become a better tutor, it seems like a no-brainer. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say and what your team has developed and all that good stuff. So I'll keep admitting people while you present, and we should be good to go. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. It's a small group, so
I'm sorry to interrupt there. This is Jack from Streamline Tutors. It's Elena's saying that she's still trying to get in. She's waiting for the host to start.
So I'm in.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Jack.
Perfect. All right, go ahead, Neil. Thank you.
Okay, so we got a looks like a pretty small group. So I'm going to jump in. I've got some slides I'll run through, but then what I think I'll do is run through those pretty quickly and then open it up for questions, and let's just see where the conversation goes. So specifically, I want to start by, let me share a screen here. One moment. I want to start by talking about how cognitive, just so we can get all on the same page, let's talk about how cognitive skills inform tutoring, how that's going to inform your tutors, the kind of information you can extract from these things, and how to use them. Then let's talk about how they impact conversations with parents, and let's talk about a little bit about the market as a whole, since we're all here in the same business, and then let's open it up for questions. So let's start with the assumption that a kid comes in, takes a practice test, you see that first set of score results, and you see that the student is struggling with reading comp. So at this point, the goal is clear. The goal is clear to everyone. We know we got to fix that reading comp in order to get this score up. That's the goal, but the problem, what's driving that, is likely to be one of these three things. So, and specifically with reading comp, these are the likely culprits. So it could be working memory, meaning that, the minute you stop reading, you start forgetting, and that gap between the passage and the answer choices that the test makers love to exploit with tricky answer choices. The student is having trouble retaining the information and holding the information from the passage in his or her head while answering the questions. And that's causing all sorts of problems. So that's working memory. That could be the problem. It could be verbal reasoning. Memory could be fine, but the student is having trouble making sense of the passage, right? So the information in the passage, you ask, hey, what's the main idea? And they kind of like fumble through some paraphrase of the first sentence, but they're having, like, the thing isn't snapping into focus. That's verbal reasoning. Or maybe the verbal reasoning is fine, it's processing speed. So the memory is fine, they can make sense of it, but it takes a little bit longer for it to all snap into focus. Now, rarely is it as quite cut and dried as I'm going to present it here. It's likely to be some combination of these three things, and there could be other factors as well. If the student is struggling with attention, let's say, it may not matter where the verbal reasoning is if he never even gets there. But the point is that your response and the strategies that you choose are going to differ dramatically on what the problem is, what the cause of the reading comp problem is. So let's take a look one by one. So let's imagine that it is clearly, so let's imagine that we've tested the student, we've seen their mind print, and we see that the student has specifically weak working memory. Okay, now we know that's going to impact the reading comp. And we also know specifically what to do about it, right? We've got to help that student. We got to help that student hold on to that information and in a way that they can make use of it in order to answer the questions, right? So that's going to mean underlining and notating the passage, making sure the student goes back and identifies proof for every single question, right? Like, we don't want them answering from memory because we know memory is part of the problem. We're certainly going to want them to articulate what's going on so that they can try to develop a fix it in their head. We're going to want them to do maybe even one question at a time, like do a question, go back to the passage, do a question, go back to the passage, rather than reading the whole thing up front, because they can read the whole thing up front, but if they don't retain it, that's just going to be a waste of time. Now, you might think that these are fairly standard strategies, and you might think, well, look, this is fine. I do this for every student. But if you're doing this for a student and the problem is, let's say, verbal reasoning and not working memory, then effectively you're spending time loading that student up with strategies that frankly he doesn't need and distracting from the ones that he does, right? So right strategy, right kid, right time. But let's imagine now that it's not working memory. Working memory is fine. Kids got no trouble loading up and holding on to that information long enough to get to the questions. But the problem is actually verbal reasoning, right? So the student's struggling to make sense of the passage. Let's say the story that's being told, whether it's a fiction passage or nonfiction, it just doesn't always snap into focus. This is a totally different problem, and is going to require a very different set of solutions. So first and foremost, let's pick the right passage, right? So this is a kid for whom picking the right passage is likely to be really important. If they start a passage and that first paragraph doesn't make sense, like, ditch it and move on to the next one, right? Like, let's not bang our head up against something that's not snapping into focus. Topics that the kid's familiar with are likely to help. So, that's another good pass through the verbal section. And then working with the kid to try to picture the story. If they can see it in their mind, it's going to help, right? They're struggling with the words, so let's turn it into pictures. Again, whether it's a fiction passage or a nonfiction passage, this is a habit that you can teach, that you can train, that specifically is going to help with this problem. And maybe if the main idea isn't coming clear, let's focus just on the specific questions, right, that don't require the main idea. We'll leave main idea and inference questions for the end, if at all, if it's a verbal reasoning problem. Now, let's imagine that memory is fine. Kid can hold the stuff in their head. Verbal reasoning is fine. They can make sense of it. But our problem is processing speed. So it's actually taking longer to do all of this stuff. Given the time, students going to get there, strong in the other two things, but it takes this student more time to get there. So in this case, first of all, worrying about the clock and worrying about speed is absolutely going to lead to errors for this kid and probably make them wildly uncomfortable. And which, by the way, also tends to impact other skills. So anxiety tends to depress working memory and reasoning skills. So now you've compounded the problem. But for this student, like first and foremost, pacing targets, right? Let's figure out how many passages and how many questions the student can get to while maintaining accuracy, knowing that if you try to push past that point before the student's ready, you're going to start leading to errors and you're going to start spending time on things that are not yielding points. So that's going to be crucial. Then simple things like crossing off wrong answer choices so that the student isn't wasting time going back and reevaluating, reprocessing answers that they've already covered. Let's get rid of those so that they're not taking up time. Certainly on the reading comp, it's probably memorizing instructions. On other sections, it's memorizing everything that can be memorized up front before test day so that on test day, you're not taking time and bandwidth away from processing with stuff that could be memorized, right? We're going to use memory to take the load off of processing and free up that space to think through stuff as needed. And last, for this particular kid, I'd consider SAT over ACT. We'll look at where Mindprint comes down on that in a second. But this is likely to be an SAT kid, not an ACT kid. So it's already hard enough to get students to change their actions on test day. We know this, right? If it were easy, the tutoring would take 5 minutes. If you load them up with too many strategies, frankly, none of those strategies are going to make it to test day. The key is pick a small number of strategies, pick the ones that are required for that particular kid, and then drill them hard until they're habit. Right strategy, right kid, right time. So that's what, this is a little shot of the second page of a Mindprint report. And this is specifically what the second page does. It goes section by section and it calls out those strategies that are going to be important for each student based on that student's cognitive skill set. So each strategy is a live link to an instructor toolbox that describes the strategy, why it works, who needs it, how to teach it. Your veterans probably don't need this. They are probably doing a lot of this automatically already anyway, I hope. But look, for your newbies, this could be A, an absolute lifesaver, and B, a way for you to make sure that your newbies are doing the right thing when they're in session and you're not there to watch them, rather than going off the reservation and making shit up, which can get dangerous. So here's what a basic Mindprint cognitive profile looks like. Now, we also have a student version, so you may or may not choose to share this version. But what you're looking at here functionally is a bell curve. So the blue is what we call the chunky middle. That's the mean, the median, and the mode. This represents students between the 17th and 84th percentile. So this is where most kids live, where most of their scores are going to fall on an age-appropriate basis. Everything is normed by age. Anything over here in the green, that means it's in the top 16% by age. If it's got a star, it's in the top 5%. Anything in the purple, that's in the bottom 16% by age. If there's a square over here, it's the bottom 5%. First thing I tend to look at are complex reasoning skills. So abstract reasoning, verbal reasoning, and spatial perception. Now, right off the bat, here's an extraordinarily capable kid. That abstract reasoning is in the top 5 percentile, so it's incredibly strong. Probably a math science kid, given that the verbal skills on a relative basis are a little bit weaker. But verbal reasoning, totally fine, right in the middle of the expected range. Spatial perception, right in the middle of the expected range. This is an entirely capable kid. There is nothing in K-12 that this kid can't handle. Next thing to take a look at are memory skills. So we've got visual versus verbal. And right off the bat, we see the visual is great. So if the kid can see it in his head, or if it comes at the kid in a non-verbal way, it is likely to stick. Verbal memory, fine, but on a relative basis, if you need this kid to remember a bunch of stuff, give it to him in pictures or make sure he can see it in his mind. Next up is executive functions. So attention, working memory, flexible thinking. Now, this student is likely struggling with executive functions. He has no trouble understanding the content. The complex reasoning skills are fine, but we've got a short attention span, flexible thinking, doesn't try new things easily, doesn't change course easily, which means probably doesn't take direction very well. Now, let's imagine this kid in class. If there's an abstract concept being discussed, he probably knows the answer before anyone else. So he's going to get bored. He can start looking out the window. His teacher tells him what to do, but he doesn't listen, and he's going to do it his own way anyway because of that weak flexible thinking. Then when he's studying, he gets things conceptually and thinks, okay, I got this, I understand it, but hasn't retained any of the details that he's read, and so can't use them on test day. So he's underperforming on his tests. He also, frankly, may have missed stuff in class, either because of attention or because it was verbal, because most of class is verbal, and he understood it conceptually, but again, it didn't stick. So there's likely to be content gaps that you're going to have to discover. A lot of teachers may have written this kid off, right? Like, even though he's wildly capable. So this, of course, could lead to frustration. It could lead to anger towards his teachers and an anxiety. Now, I want to draw a clear distinction between what we know because we've measured it, visual memory stronger than verbal memory, we know this, versus how it's expressed in what is effectively an assumption that we're making. So we haven't met this kid yet. We don't know how these things are going to be expressed. The student may already have come up with ways to compensate for some of these weaknesses, and you don't really know until you meet them, but we know a lot on day one. Before you even walk in, and in particular, we know whether a lot of the things the kid's struggling with are, the way we think of it, a can't or a won't, right? And if it's a can't and you treat it like a won't, then you're going to lose that kid because he's going to stop listening to you. If it's a won't and you treat it like a can't, then you're going to leave a lot of points on the table because you're not going to push the kid as hard as you probably could. Now, all of these things translate into scores with remarkable consistency. So here's the student's projected scoring range on the SAT. If you look at this stretch range, she has the potential to score really well, but as we know, there are some things that you're going to need to address. So we've got her as a strong lean towards SAT, predominantly driven by math science on ACT versus math on SAT. And the reason for that is likely to be, if we look at verbal reasoning and the abstract reasoning, this is a 2x2 chart looking at the relationship between accuracy and speed. So upper right, fast and accurate, lower left, slow and inaccurate. Verbal reasoning, the major axes are average. Verbal reasoning, as you can see, is fine. It's pretty much average in terms of accuracy, although slow. Abstract reasoning, incredible in terms of accuracy, but very slow, right? So these are things that are likely to make the ACT far more of a struggle than the SAT, but that abstract reasoning could pay huge dividends on the SAT given the time. Now, we haven't seen any actual scores on this student yet, but here's a section by section breakdown of the projected ranges. And depending on where she's scoring now, this is going to tell you where to put your attention. On which sections is she underperforming compared to what she's capable of? So in other words, where's the low-hanging fruit? What are my priorities as a tutor? Where am I going to find those points, and where those points are going to be easiest to come by? And that's what this worksheet does. We know what the projected ranges are because we know what the cognitive profile says, but what we don't know is the actual scores. That's something that you can fill in. Okay, now imagine that everything that we just talked about is your intake call. This is the conversation you're having with the parent on day one. Right off the bat, you're displaying a level of insight and sophistication, and a sophistication of analysis that frankly she's not going to find anywhere else. And this is day one. And so effectively you're telling that parent, A, you understand her kid, right? Like that's crucial. B, you got a plan for how to fix the things that need to get fixed. And C, you are one hell of an expert. And again, this is that very first conversation. That conversation is going to impress the hell out of the client, buy you a ton of confidence, and at the same time, give you a lot of working room to get those scores moving. And by the way, I should tell you that students with weak flexible thinking are harder to coach. It takes more time for you to get them to try something new and to make it stick. Now, not only can you set that expectation up front when you're talking to the parent, but it also doesn't just sound like you're trying to sell them more hours. You can actually back this up with science. You can point to the reason for why you're setting this expectation, and that expectation is going to be something that's really important to set. So now let's talk about the market as a whole. I pulled all of these from the homepage of Kaplan, Princeton Review, Varsity, and Appleroth. So here's Princeton Review. Our expert instructors are the secret behind Princeton Review's success. Award-winning ACT tutors from Varsity, expert ACT tutoring for students at all levels. Kaplan, smart teachers make smarter prep. Appleroth, I thought, summed it up the best. At Appleroth, you'll learn proven test strategies from the most effective tutors using the most innovative materials in the nation. So you may not, in fact, you probably don't see yourself as competing with the Kaplans and Princeton Reviews and Varsities of the world anymore. But their messages are, in fact, pretty representative. And look, we all talk about having great tutors. We all talk about how effective our training is. We all talk about having smart strategies and how they're going to make a difference and amazing materials and content. If this is your messaging on the phone or on the website to an uninformed customer, you are no different from these guys. Like, we're all out there promising the same thing. You got this tiny window when you're on the phone with folks to display your expertise and build trust. And the best way to do that is show them how well you understand their kid before you, and this is before you've even met their kid, right? So it looks almost like a mind reading trick. It's like incredible when you see their face go, oh my God, how did you know that? Right? Like suddenly you've gone somewhere on day one that nobody else can go. And that is unbelievably powerful. Okay, that was a lot of stuff. I want to stop here and take some questions. I'm looking at the attendee list, and I see Elena here. Elena, so Elena works at Smarty Prep. You guys, I think, started using MindPrint maybe a little over a year and a half ago, and I think that you're offering MindPrints for free to anyone who calls you up looking for SAT versus ACT. And then you get them on the phone and talk through the results. So I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit from your point of view as someone who's actively using this every day and on the phone with parents. How do those conversations go down? And how's it working for you guys?
Sure. So I find it very valuable in terms of determining SAT versus ACT. I'd say like half the people calling in interested in test prep are actively seeking guidance on SAT versus ACT. Many come in expecting, just to do SAT. So the conversation is really, informing them of why it's important to choose the best test for their student. It's a first step in our onboarding process. Have the intro call, explain the purpose of Mindprint, and then get the kids set up to take it. Within a few days, I send them the results and have a follow-up call where we go through the results, what it means in terms of SAT versus ACT, and I also use it to help match with tutors. So one of the things we have been doing is having some of our tutors take Mindprint as well. And I find it's, flexible thinking you mentioned in particular. I think it's very important that if I see a student with pretty low flexible thinking, I'm setting them up with one of our tutors who has stronger flexible thinking so that they can, adapt to work with a student who maybe is less coachable. So setting up two people, for instance, with low flexible thinking is, we've noticed in the past, hasn't worked, as well. So that's kind of another, reason we incorporate Mindprint. Another thing is sifting out potential learning differences. That's been really important because, if there are any kind of red flags or something that we think, warrants further testing, it's important that those things are addressed head on versus finding ourselves in a position later on where we're not seeing the score improvements that anyone wants to see. It's been very, very valuable.
And out of curiosity, what does it do for conversions? So you're using it pre-sale, you get them on the phone, you talk them through, then what happens?
I'd say it's very valuable. I mean, it's a little tough to compare to other businesses because most of the incoming inquiries that we get, it's word of mouth. So they're already pretty confident in what we have to offer. But I think it solidifies that. It shows that, you're paying top price for individualized instruction. And this just shows how we provide that individualized instruction. It's not just a one size fits all. We're really taking the time to understand the student, understand how they process information, how they learn, what tests they should pursue, and what tutor they should be matched with.
Thank you for all that. It's as tutors, if you're doing one-on-one and you are not differentiating your instruction based on the individual needs of the kids, like, frankly, you might as well be a CD-ROM, if I'm showing my age. But like, that's the whole point of doing one-on-one, is to leverage this. If you go in and I know, like, when I was carrying a high load of students, it's really easy to go on autopilot and walk in and like teach your reading comp lesson the way you teach it to every kid. But that is not taking advantage of what makes one-on-one. And probably not optimizing based on what that kid needs. All right, let's go to questions. So, Sunny, how do kids react to taking another assessment before the actual course? As most of them don't favor any type of test or assessment. So a couple things, and I'd love to hear Elena's response to this as well. Last thing we want to do is make kids take more tests. I will say that this one, it's online, it's self-paced, it only takes an hour. There's no math, there's no reading comp, there's no multiple choice. It doesn't look and feel like a standardized test. They don't know that yet, but by the time they actually do it, they, in my experience, they're wildly curious about what it tells them and how it tells them that. So it's a pretty, you got to get them there. But also, you as the expert are really reinforcing your role as the expert. You're saying, look, I need this info in order to help your student. And usually they do it. They may not like taking an SAT, but everyone gets why you ask them to do it. And the key is to frame this up in the same way. Elena, do you get a lot of pushback from kids taking tests?
I actually kind of stole this verbiage from Jack, my colleague, who's also on the webinar. I refer to it as a series of mini brain games. So oftentimes there is initial pushback, like, oh, another test, but I convince them pretty quickly when I say, look, nothing SAT and ACT related in terms of content. It's self-paced. A lot of times parents are like, oh, is it timed? Because maybe their student has, accommodations. So I do mention it's self-paced, and I refer to it as, a series of mini brain games. And also I think it's important, historically pre-Mindprint, in order to determine which test, they had to often take, a full-length ACT to compare to their PSAT scores. So this way, we're actually kind of being a bit more proactive and making it so they don't necessarily have to take 2 tests as a default. So
you're actually getting there faster. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And I imagine it also identifies, it probably weeds out a few people who really aren't serious about it, right? Like to the extent that they're not going to do it, that they're probably not going to sign up in the first place.
Exactly. Yep.
So Kate asks how many questions are in the Mindprint assessment, and yeah.
So Kate, the easiest way to answer that is for me to just send you a trial version that you can look at yourself. It is not a series of questions. It doesn't look like a standardized test. It's really is, as Elena and Jack put it, a series of brain games. In some cases, you're clicking on moving boxes. In some cases, you are trying to remember words. In some cases, you're trying to identify things as they pop up. It's not a, what are those like Myers-Briggs kinds of things? I don't know, it's actual, like, it's what the cognitive scientists use. It's what NASA uses.
Best way for me to see is just to see.
Yeah, I can send you one and like take it, kick the tires, see what it looks like for sure.
Yeah, there are definitely some real traps that I've fallen into because I've misassessed people with A grades in math, and they can't add. So, this would maybe take care of that.
We like to say, like, you don't know what you don't know. Number one, and number two, it's not all this stuff is available or accessible by straight observation. Mm-hmm. And you do get those kids where like there's something more going on that you're not aware of until you really dig in.
Yeah. I have a couple in mind that I'd love to test now, earlier, later, at some point. It's a very, very valuable tool.
Let's try them out, and you'll get a pretty good read on them. Mm-hmm. And it's actually not painful. Like they're not going to hate you for making them take the test. It's kind of cool. Yeah.
So Neil, Elena asks if we can look through a few of the reports from the SAT versus ACT portion of the Mindprint.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull some up. I just kind of snapshotted some bits from.
Yeah, it would just be helpful to maybe talk through some kind of, key skills to look at. You mentioned processing speed, obviously, is a big red flag for the ACT more so than the SAT. I tend to think of flexible thinking being a little bit more important on the SAT because it's wordier and trickier. But I was wondering if, maybe we could just walk through a few examples. I'm more curious about the ones that are kind of more toss-ups. I usually understand why, a student has a 130-point advantage on the SAT. It's pretty clear, but sometimes it's not as straightforward. And I think it would be helpful to kind of look at some give and take.
Yeah. So I'm clipping off the top here because this is an actual student and I don't want to reveal student info.
Yeah, sure.
The way we generate this is we have a big data set of kids who have taken a Mindprint and have an actual official SAT score, and taken a Mindprint and have an official ACT score. So the correlation between mind print skills as we measure them and SAT or ACT scores are remarkably consistent. We do this in real time, so we're constantly adding more kids into the data set. But at this point, it doesn't move by all that much because it's like they fall into quite clear buckets. Then what I do is I'll take the midpoint of your SAT score. I'll use College Board and ACT's published concordance tables, and I'll compare that to the midpoint of your ACT score. So if you look at this particular kid on composite scores, SAT midpoint is 1290. If you use the published concordance table, that's gonna match up to a 27. But the midpoint of this kid's ACT score, as measured by us, is a 28. So we say, all right, that means this kid is leaning just a little bit towards ACT. We call that student preference because it's not a strong enough lean to say you must go one way or the other. In this case, you're probably going to let the kid go with whichever test he feels better about or more comfortable with. And or you as the tutor dig in and you realize, oh, wait a minute, like this kid had never seen the science section before. I think that science score is going to pop up. Let's go science. Now, there are patterns. There are clear patterns. And the first and foremost, at the end of the day, verbal reasoning efficiency rules the roost. This rules the roost both in terms of academic performance, and because we work with NWEA MAP, we have academic achievement data, and it makes sense. Like school, for the most part, is a very verbal endeavor. Kids sit in class and we talk at them, and if they're good at learning that way, then they're fine. If they're not good at learning that way, then there's trouble. And this is also true on both SAT and ACT, but also across all sections. Verbal reasoning efficiency, and efficiency meaning that combination of speed and accuracy, is determinative even on math sections, even on the science section, even on the grammar sections. Now, it is particularly dominant in ACT land because, just because of speed, right? Like if your efficiency is not at a minimum level, the ACT is going to be a struggle. There's a little bit more time per question on the SAT. And so if that efficiency is slow, the SAT is likely to be a better test. Now, on the SAT, two other things come into play a little bit more, which is flexible thinking and abstract reasoning. And the way I tend to think about this, if you go back to the origins of these tests, the ACT generally set about to test to the degree to which kids learned the content that they experienced in school. Whereas SAT has always tried to test how good they are as thinkers, how strong a thinker are they, independent of any one set of body of knowledge. Now, SAT does that using the language of math and reading and grammar, same as the ACT, which is why they tend to look similar. But in design, from going all the way back to the early days, the intent was a little bit different. And that's why in SAT land, you often see questions that are designed to be unfamiliar to kids, right? Like that's where they put it in these real world scenarios and they show them things in a way that the kids may not recognize to see if they can think their way through it. Now, kids with strong flexible thinking are able to adjust to that. Kids who learn things in an abstract way and are strong abstract thinkers, the SAT absolutely rewards that. If you see an SAT math question, from a scoring standpoint, there's three outcomes. You could get the question wrong, you could get the question right, and it took you 1 minute, or you could get the question right and it took you 6 minutes. And one of the things the SAT is doing is separating kids into those 3 buckets. And you can see this in the question design, right? Like I sometimes joke, you can tell the age of their math teacher based on their SAT math score. If it's an old school reading, writing, arithmetic, then they struggle a little more in the SAT. But if they've been taught things in a very abstract, conceptual way, the SAT rewards that. If they have those skills from a cognitive standpoint, then the SAT feels a lot more comfortable. If they don't, the ACT is a little bit more straightforward. But what makes the ACT harder is more the clock than the style of content. And that's where the efficiency piece comes in. Now, some things will trump this, excuse my adjective, depending on, like attention, right? Like if the kid has weak attention and over 4 hours, their attention out the window in the middle of a section, oops. Sorry about that. I just yanked my headphone out. And their attention goes out the window in the middle of a section. It doesn't matter what their verbal reasoning efficiency was because they haven't read the damn question in the first place. Right. So there are, all of these things play together. Does that, Elaine, does that answer your question? Does that help?
It does. How do you determine the efficiency of each of the cognitive skills? Is that using their processing speed, or are you testing or assessing processing or like the speed of each skill in the exercise?
So we're looking at both accuracy and speed by test in the battery, but also overall. Not everything has a time component. And when we look at the basic MindPrint profile, which is what we use predominantly with schools, we don't take the speed into account because speed tends to play less of a role in class. But we absolutely do take into account on the test prep reports where that speed and therefore efficiency is crucial. So that's where you'll see, like that kid that we looked at a minute ago, we had abstract reasoning as top 5% because of accuracy, even though the kid was in like bottom 5% for speed. And that's because on the MindPrint profile, again, we're focused on the accuracy because that's what's important in school. But then when we translate it into the test prep report, we take the speed into account as well. It's at the end of the day, it's a time test.
Neil, have you had a chance yet to look at actual student performance on the actual exams relative to sort of where you project them to be? And yeah,
I mean, actually, that is how we generate our data. So like none of this is speculative. All of this comes directly from the data set and how that data correlates from MindPrint assessment to actual scores. Now, what you're asking is when a company, let's say like Smarty Prep, uses it, how often do kids fall outside of their projected range? And I look at everybody and it's, I saw a kid once who was way above the projected range because the kid was ADHD, was not on meds when he took his MindPrint. But then over the course of tutoring, was diagnosed, went on meds, scores leveled out, and the kid blew past his projected score. I saw a kid a few months back out of California who, frankly, just had an incredible tutor who worked with that kid for, like a year and a half intensively. Tutored an extraordinary job, taught the kid to work with strengths and account for weaknesses and got the kid past the projected range. Like it's possible, it happens. But I don't know. Elena, how often have you seen kids fall outside of the projected range when you're looking at actual scores?
Quite frankly, I like to see us get in the stretch score range. So it all depends on, what their starting point is. The way that I tend to think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but people are always asking me, okay, so what is the significance of this midpoint? And I kind of think like midpoint is where a student can get if they kind of just do some prep. Like, is that a good way of thinking about it? Because most people don't come in already hitting their midpoint.
Yeah, so the midpoint, when we generate the ranges, we are not accounting for whether they have prepped or not prepped. The midpoint is simply the mean, the median, and the mode of the data. It is the score that occurs most frequently. It's the score that most kids end up with. And when you line up all the scores, it's the score in the middle. Now, some kids have already figured out a lot of these things intuitively, and they're overperforming. Not overperforming, but they're at the high end of their range. And some kids are underperforming, and a lot of that happens by section. So maybe they're overperforming in math, but underperforming in the writing. I do think that the consistency with which a tutor gets their kids into that stretch range, like, do they do it 80% of the time? Do they do it 60% of the time? Do they do it 90% of the time? The consistency, I think, is actually a better measure of student performance than score improvements, which are flawed as a measure for a whole bunch of reasons. But like, can you as a tutor get to the kid to their highest end of their potential? And that's our job, right? That's why they pay us money.
And another thing too is when a student comes to us with, accommodations already in place on both the SAT and ACT, our thought is that for the most part, if you have the same accommodations on both tests, for most students, it makes sense to pursue the ACT because the extra time is specifically extra time, goes further on the ACT. But recently I've started actually giving those students mind prints as well, just to kind of still understand, the way their brain works, because a lot of times they say, I have extra time for an ADHD diagnosis. Okay, but like, let's really see, what's going on, because, that only means so much. So I do like these results don't take into consideration, obviously, whether they have accommodations. So do you have like a certain lens that you kind of interpret the results if they do have extra time, for instance?
I like to think about the accommodations in the way they're intended, which is not to give a kid an advantage that it is to try to level the playing field, but it's really, you give an accommodation, whether it's time or breaks or a private room or big print or whatever it is, you give them that accommodation in order to give them the opportunity to show the quality of their thinking, right? It's not let me give you a leg up. And so the extra time on the ACT, because it is often time that makes the ACT hard, often, especially for capable kids, that is really determinative. But if the kid is struggling with complex reasoning, that extended time isn't, it's not likely to change it might give them a little bit more time to reason, but it's not the time that's the problem for that student. It's the complex reasoning skills, right? So you still, as a tutor, need to figure out right strategy, right kid, whatever that circumstance is.
Can I ask a question to Elena?
Wait, what did you say?
Can I ask you a question directly?
Oh, sure. Sorry, Jack came on at the same time, so I didn't know if Jack was talking or you. But yes, go ahead.
I do have a question for Neil afterwards, but go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, thanks, Jack. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Elena, have you seen an impact to the overall business, like an incremental increase in enrollments as a result of using Mindprint, or is it too soon to tell?
what it's done is really solidify and make our onboarding process very kind of well known in the community, because I spend like anywhere from like 45 minutes to an hour and a half, multiple calls with every client before they sign on and pay us any money. So I think the word has spread about Mindprint and the time we take to determine which test is the best fit. So I would say that that's kind of the reputation. I don't necessarily notice, necessarily like it's helped increase the number of inquiries we get, but it's also kind of a strange time. So it's hard to, determine that.
As someone who talks to a lot of tutoring companies and sees a lot of data come through our system, your data and the number of kids coming through has stayed strong or increased over the last year, whereas a lot of folks, are down, some cases 60, 70%.
You busy? I do know that.
Yeah,
something that's interesting that we do is I actually created a Google form with the pre-Mindprint, survey questions for the parent about like diagnosis, concern, no concern. So I actually send it to them in a Google form, and then once they fill that out, we then set them up in Mindprint and send them, the instruction packet. So we kind of field out who is really interested and committed in the process. And if they never fill out that Google form after I bug them about it, then move on. So that's also a way that we make sure we're not just handing out Mindprints to anyone and everyone. We kind of filter through that.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely echo everything that Elena mentioned. And I, even though it has not, really had that sort of percentage revenue increase for us, now I think that there's a lot of context that kind of frames that in a way that doesn't mean that that's not going to be the case in the future. And what it does do is allow us to claim higher scores. Something that I say a lot in conversing. Well, we've run a few webinars, ACT versus SAT webinars, where we talk about Mindprint briefly at the end. And I'll always say, we have to run the numbers on this to get the exact statistics, but there's definitely an average improvement in the scores that we're able to turn as a whole. And sure, like Neil mentioned, some of the veteran tutors are going to be doing a lot of this naturally and perceiving this need in students naturally, but on average, as a company, for some of those younger tutors, we're able to propel a higher score improvement on both ACT and SAT. But I had a question, Neil, about a particular student who just seemed on paper to knock the Mindprint out of the park. Everything in the top 16% box there, nothing in the low expected, nothing in skills to support. And he's having such a tough time bringing that to bear on his actual test. And so I was wondering, what are the other factors at play? Right? What would you say, your kind of, I don't know, top 3 ideas that would come to mind when we see a student that is that buttoned up cognitively? And I could get into some of the details that I'm seeing with him, like interpersonally and my insights into who he is as a learner, but like seeing that Mindprint result and then comparing that to what his curriculum has been has been really interesting for me. And I would wonder like how many experiences you've had like that and how you respond.
Newton's second law: for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Like the one thing we know from the data is that there is no such thing as a brain that is strong in everything. The brain cannot do it all. So in fact, the only time that we ever see kids who have all of their skills disproportionately weighted at the very high end of our range are kids who are on the spectrum. And it's the SEL skills that fall off a cliff on the other end. Because the brain can't do it all at the same time. One pattern that I've seen that is relatively, I don't know, common is the right word because every kid is different, but I do see regularly kids with very strong complex reasoning skills that are often offset by weaker executive functions as a whole, or in particular, weaker flexible thinking. And these are the kids that are infuriating as a tutor, because you sit with them and they look you in the eye and you know they understand everything you're telling them, and they nod, and you ask them the question, they get it right when they're sitting with you, and then they walk out of the room and it's like you were never there. And it's like they're elastic. They snap right back into form, and everything that you everything that you told them is gone, and they do it the way they did it before you ever walked in the room.
So how do you solve for that? That's the exact student that I have on my kids right now. Like, to a T.
It takes a lot of time. I tend to go very Pavlovian. I don't want my kids thinking on test day, because that gets them into trouble. I want them to see this, do that. And if I can turn it into a habit, I can hopefully try to rewire some of these actions with physical habits. Like I can't control their brain, but I can control their hand. And if I can control their hand, by extension, I can control their brain. So if I can get them to do the same thing with their hand every time, I can get them to do the same thing with their head every time. But, like right off the bat, when you get the kid with the weak, flexible thinking, like it's going to take longer.
That's pro gamer tutoring. That's what my son would say.
Yeah.
It's a pro gamer move, man.
I asked him to debrief his experience on a test that he took 3 weeks ago. And encyclopedically, he went through which questions were an issue for him and which questions went well. And then I was like, and you can remember all of those questions specifically, but not remember your percent formula,
Kevin, maybe we should do like tutoring on Twitch and have everyone like observe tutoring sessions in action. This is like classic weak, flexible thinking. He's absolutely aware of what's going on, and yet struggles to change the way he does it when it happens. If he's taken a test and you can see time per question, these are the kids that are used to getting things right because wildly smart. But when you see that question wrong and you get hung up on it, I'm going to guess that this kid would throw 4, 5, 6, 8 minutes after a question that he's gotten wrong, because he keeps banging his head on it and can't adjust in the moment because of that weak, flexible thinking, right? Like he's totally aware of when the struggle is going on and yet can't make the adjustment. So like you got to teach him to be aware of when he's stuck, and then give him very specific solutions for what to do, which probably involve walking away from the question, resetting his brain, and coming back and looking at it with fresh eyes, which involves maybe trying a different methodology, paraphrasing both answer choices and content. Like you got to give him the strategies to get his brain off the track that it's on when he's stuck.
Could he be overanalyzing it? Like so smart that he tries to outsmart the question because he can make a case for the second most probable answer. I'm talking about, like, these kids that they're certainly smart enough and they can process quickly enough, and they come down to 2 answer choices, and they go with the wrong one the majority of the time because they can make an argument in their head for it. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Problem with
it's there's a lot that's true in here. It is a more complex kid that I think we're getting to. So it's not. I do. Maybe we should connect offline or something, Neil. I don't know. It's just been a tough one.
Happy to connect offline. It's hard to dig into the kid without actually seeing the results. But I there's sort of a bigger meta point to be made here, which is that as a tutor, like the minute you put Mindprint into the mix, like there's all these things that we've intuited and sensed and seen over the years that suddenly you have words for, and suddenly the patterns become more clear. And now you're able to figure out this kid and put that into your toolbox and then use it on the next kid who also has a similar pattern. Like, I think it really does raise the boats for everybody. It makes the whole org team and tutor team as a crew a little bit smarter and a little bit more sophisticated in their thinking. And it's really fun to watch when that happens.
I'm sorry. We're going to have to wrap it shortly here, but Kate asked, can Mindprint be used for academic tutoring? And I know it can, but if so, how?
Yeah, well, okay. So the first thing is we're normed for ages 8 through 21, by age. That's first thing. Second thing, the bulk of the business actually is in K-12 districts. It's helping teachers differentiate instruction for their kids. That's where Mindprint came from. The test prep application is relatively new. That's what I've created since I've been here. So it is, in fact, really designed for academic instruction in some ways more than test prep. We found that the data worked, and so we were able to do test prep. But our goal overall is let's create confident, self-directed, strong learners over time. And that's that self-awareness, the SEL piece. I think ultimately that's really the most powerful expression of this at the end of the day. Teach kids to advocate for themselves, teach them to know who they are and what they need, and give them the skills to do it. And that's that is why we're here.
Awesome. So do you have a slide with your contact information, or you want me to just...
I didn't. I didn't make one.
Mindprint Education?
Yes. Silly me. That was a bad move. That was not pro gamer level.
That's just because you're not a salesperson. You're an academic, right?
I guess at heart, yes.
Yeah. I'll
sorry, not mindprintlearning.com, not Mindprint Education. Kate, try it, right? Send me an email. I'll set you up with some trial credits, and the adult trial, and try it with kids well, so that you can really look at it. Try it with kids who already have scores, so you can look at the scoring ranges, and it makes a lot more sense when you're actually looking at it with real kids and real data.
Well, it makes sense actually right now. I mean, that's it's frustrating because I have very good instincts, but they're not as good as they could be. This just sounds like something that could increase my predictive accuracy. I've got 2 girls, twins, who are causing me trouble right now. Turns out they did a whole prep before they came to me.
Mm-hmm.
Signed up without telling me, and then mentioned it after they signed up. And so, I don't think there's much more. I think they pulled 20 on the March test, 20 points on the SAT.
Oh,
really
okay.
Pathetic, but it'd be nice to be able. I generally just keep working with people if they don't go up, but it'd be nice to know where they belong, to know what reasonable goal they
know when they're done, right? That's actually really valuable. Is no, you're at the point of diminishing returns. Go focus on your GPA and your essays and your extracurriculars.
I'd like to do that before I begin the prep, not after. It'd be nice to get it in the right order. So this looks like it might really solve my problem.
Okay, well, so shoot me an email, and let's set you up some trial credits and try it out. I would imagine, if you've worked with a lot of kids, that most of the time when you sit down with a kid and you try to figure out what he or she needs, you're probably dead on. But then every now and then these kids, these head scratchers come up, and it's really good to have some.
Another metric.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm having trouble.
All right. So thank you, Neil, for joining us. And
Thank you, Kevin.
We'll do a recording and send it out to everyone once I get it edited and uploaded, probably Monday or Tuesday. And thanks everyone for joining. Tell your friends about Test Prep Professionals and point them our way. Thanks. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks for doing this, Kevin.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Kate. Have a great weekend.
Too.